They came to kill him before dawn. 40 men, one from each clan of the Quraysh tribe. The plan was deliberate in its precision. If every family shared the killing, no single clan could be held responsible. The ancient law of Arabia, blood demands blood, would be paralyzed by its own logic. Muhammad ibn Abdullah would simply cease to exist, and with him this dangerous new faith that had split families in two, emptied the idol temples, and threatened the wealth of an entire city. It was the year 622 of the Common Era. The Prophet was 52 years old. He had been preaching for 13 years. And that night, rather than run, he asked his cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib, a young man barely 22, to sleep in his bed, to wear his green cloak, to lie still and trust that no harm would come. Then Muhammad walked out of his own house, recited a verse over the men waiting in the darkness, and passed through them unseen. This is the Hijra, the migration, the journey from Mecca to Medina that became the pivot on which all of Islamic history turns. The moment a persecuted community stopped merely surviving and began to build a civilization. So defining was this single act that Muslims across the world still count their years from it. Not from the birth of a prophet, not from the night of the first revelation, from a walk into the desert. Once you understand what that journey cost and what it founded, you will never look at this faith, or at the origins of human civilization, the same way again. To understand the Hijra, you have to understand what Mecca was and what it stood to lose. In the early 7th century, Mecca was a merchant city, arid, hierarchical, and fiercely proud. It controlled the most consequential trade routes on the Arabian Peninsula. Its power rested on the Kaaba, the ancient stone sanctuary that housed the idols of dozens of Arab tribes. Pilgrims arrived, trade followed. The ruling tribe, the Quraysh, were the custodians of this arrangement, and their prosperity depended entirely on maintaining it. When Muhammad began preaching in 610 CE that there was only one God, that the stone idols were nothing, that the poor had claims the powerful were ignoring, it was not merely a spiritual challenge, it was a threat to an economic order that had stood for generations. For 13 years, the Quraysh responded with contempt, then mockery, then coordinated violence. His followers were not spared. Bilal ibn Rabah, an Abyssinian slave and one of the first men to embrace Islam, was dragged across the burning sand of Mecca with a boulder on his chest and told to renounce. He said, only one word, over and over, Ahad, one. The oneness of God spoken in a single syllable under torture. Sumayya bint Khayyat, a freed slave, an elderly woman, was killed for her faith, becoming what Islamic tradition regards as the first martyr of the religion. By the year 622, the situation had become impossible. 2 years earlier, a delegation had arrived from the northern oasis city of Yathrib. They had heard of Muhammad, studied his message, and come with an offer. Come to us. Arbitrate between our warring tribes. We will shelter you. We will protect whoever follows you. Yathrib would soon be given a new name, Al-Madina al-Nabawiyya, the city of the Prophet, Medina. The migration did not happen in a single night. It happened in waves, quietly, over many months. Long before Muhammad himself moved, he had instructed his companions to begin leaving Mecca in small groups without announcement. Families slipped away in the early mornings. Men sold what they could and abandoned what they couldn't carry. The Quraysh understood, even before the Prophet departed, that something irreversible was unfolding. They responded by intercepting families, separating husbands from wives, mothers from children. The historian Ibn Ishaq, writing in the 8th century from accounts passed down by the companions, preserves a devastating image of a man named Abu Salama, who tried to leave for Medina with his wife and their infant son. The Quraysh stopped his wife's family from releasing her. His wife's family stopped his family from taking the child. For a full year, this woman sat at the edge of Mecca, separated from both her husband and her infant, weeping in the open street every day until they finally let her travel north. Alone. That is what the early Hijra looked like. Not a triumphant march, a grief-soaked departure, one family at a time. When Muhammad's own turn came, the danger was at its height. The Quraysh, watching the community reassemble elsewhere, had decided to end it. The assassination plot, 40 men, 40 blades, one strike before dawn, was their answer. And so he walked south, away from Medina, into the mountains, with only Abu Bakr al-Siddiq beside him, his closest companion, the first free adult man to believe in him. A merchant of means who had already given most of what he owned to ransom enslaved Muslims from their captors. They hid in a cave called Thawr, cut into the rocky hills south of Mecca. 3 days. Search parties swept the roads north while they sat in the dark, silent. Islamic tradition and the narrations collected in the Sirah of Ibn Hisham, records that the entrance to the cave was covered by a spider's web, freshly spun, and a nesting dove that sat undisturbed at the opening. The trackers passed the cave and moved on. A thin thread of silk, a bird's stillness, and history turned. On the third night, they moved north. A guide named Abdullah ibn Urayqit, trusted but not yet a Muslim, had been hired to lead them along a coastal path, a route the Quraysh would not anticipate. They traveled by night. They rested by day. At one point, according to the account preserved in Sahih al-Bukhari, a tracker named Suraqah ibn Malik picked up their trail and rode hard across the desert to claim the Quraysh's reward. He came close enough to see them. Then, his horse's legs sank into the sand 3 times, as if the earth would not carry him forward. He turned back. He would later, years hence, convert to Islam himself and receive from Muhammad a prophecy that one day he would wear the bracelets of the Persian emperor. History records that, under the Caliph Umar, he did. The journey to Medina took approximately 8 days. On a Monday morning, in the year 622 CE, the Prophet arrived at Quba, a settlement just south of Medina. He stopped there first and laid the foundation of what Islamic tradition identifies as the first mosque built by the Muslim community. Then he rode into Medina itself. What happened next was not a coronation. It was something stranger and more consequential. He released the reins of his camel. The animal walked slowly through the crowds, the Ansar, the helpers, the people of Medina who had pledged protection, its head turning neither left nor right. It stopped. It knelt. On that patch of ground, Muhammad built his mosque. Around that mosque, he began to construct something that 7th century Arabia had no name for yet. He called it the Ummah, a community, but not a tribe. The document of Medina, sometimes called the Constitution of Medina, recorded by Ibn Ishaq and studied by modern scholars including Montgomery Watt and Reza Aslan, was a written covenant, possibly the earliest political document of its kind in Arabia. It listed the Muslim migrants from Mecca, the Muslim tribes of Medina, and the Jewish tribes of the city as a single ummah, bound by specific mutual obligations. They would not fight each other. They would defend the city together against external attack. Disputes would be brought to Muhammad for arbitration. Rights were specified. Duties were named. This is the concept that unlocks the Hijra, not merely a flight from danger, but a founding. The scholars who debate where Islam begins, at the cave of Hira, at the first revelation, at the birth of the Prophet, overlook what the Islamic calendar itself insists upon. The Muslim year does not begin with revelation. It begins with this: a man and his companions walking through a desert, building something from nothing on the other side. The Hijra was year 0. The moment of faith in the heart became a civilization in the world. The common assumption is that Islam's power came from the sword. The history of the rapid 7th century conquests makes that assumption feel obvious. But look more closely at the Hijra and the picture becomes more complicated. 13 years in Mecca without retaliation. 13 years of watching companions tortured, of enduring economic boycotts so severe that Muslims and their allies were confined to a ravine and left to starve. Of losing the 2 people Muhammad loved most, his wife, Khadija, the first to believe in him, and his uncle Abu Talib, who had protected him since childhood, without a single act of organized violence in response. The Quranic revelations of the Meccan period speak almost entirely in the language of patience, mercy, and the long arc of divine accountability. When permission to defend was finally given, in Medina, after the migration, when the community faced genuine military threat. It came with explicit conditions. The second chapter of the Quran, revealed in Medina, states plainly, "Fight in the way of God, those who fight you, but do not transgress limits. God does not love transgressors." Non-combatants were to be protected. Prisoners had recognized rights. Retreating enemies were not to be pursued. Karen Armstrong, in her biography of the Prophet, argues that the Hijra should not be read primarily as a military pivot, but as a civilizational one, the moment faith moved from private conviction to public architecture. The community that arrived in Medina was not an army. It was a people who had lost almost everything and were building something new from the materials of a desert city and a written covenant. The migration was not an escape. It was construction. Every Muslim who has ever written a date carries this story without knowing they are carrying it. The Islamic calendar, the Hijri calendar, begins not in the year of Muhammad's birth, not in the year of the cave of Hira and the first word of Revelation, but in the year 622 CE, the year of the Hijra. This was a deliberate choice. Around 638 CE, the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, convened the companions to establish a unified administrative calendar for the growing Islamic State. Several starting points were proposed. The companions discussed and agreed. The true beginning was not a miracle, not a birth. It was the migration. Today, more than 1.8 billion Muslims mark time from that decision. When a letter is dated in the Hijri calendar, when a contract is signed, when a birth is recorded in a country that uses both the Gregorian and Islamic calendars, the number traces back to a man walking out of his house in the dark, past men who had come to kill him, south into the mountains, then north through the desert, toward a city that had promised to receive him. The spider's web held. The tracker's horse sank. The camel knelt. And from that kneeling, a civilization began to rise. He left with nothing he could not carry, no army, no guarantee. Only a companion beside him, a hired guide who had not yet entered the faith, and a certainty the Quran would preserve in Surah At-Tawbah. "Do not grieve, God is with us," spoken quietly to Abu Bakr in the darkness of the cave when footsteps passed overhead. 13 years of patience ended in that cave. 8 days of desert ended at a city gate, and everything that followed, the law, the calendar, the language of belonging that would eventually hold together a community stretching from the Atlantic to the borders of China, began not with a battle, not with a throne, but with a man releasing the reins of a camel and waiting to see where it chose to kneel. He could not have known, on that morning in Medina, that the year he arrived would one day be called Year One. That the ground beneath the camel's knees would become the center of a world. That the word he had carried out of Mecca, past the men who wanted him dead, across the desert and into this borrowed city, that word would still be spoken, still be taught, still be debated and defended and wept over, 14 centuries later, by a fifth of every human being alive. He only knew the camel had stopped, and so he began to build.